Welcome to Burning Platforms, our fortnightly look at the intersection between tech and politics, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we take a deep dive into Google's unhealthy data dominance with tech and media commentator Ricky Sutton. But first, our rundown of the latest news from around the world with our regular panel, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. So welcome to Burning Platforms. Joining us in the virtual town hall this evening, we've got our regular panelist, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea. Hi, Lizzie.
Hi, Peter.
And the great Dan Stinton, CEO of Health Engine. Hi, Dan.
G'day, Pete.
And our special guest this week is a man who runs a Substack called Future Media. He's worked for years in both the media and tech, so he kind of does country and Western. Ricky Sutton, thanks for joining us, Ricky, and I look forward to digging into some of the ideas you've been putting out there about how Google might be about to eat itself. So welcome to the room.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So what a week, and what a story. We all love her. We love Scarlett. The idea that Scarlett Johansson would be the voice of a operating system that an average guy could fall in love with. That average guy seems to have been Sam Altman, who needs no introduction, who seems to have tried to induce Scarlett to be the voice of Chatgpt 4.0, and she kind of said, as only Scarlett could, no. And he didn't take no for an answer, and it's ended up in court. Dan, what's going on? It seems too good. You couldn't write about this, could you?
It's been a fascinating story, and it's I think everyone listening probably has heard of it, but nonetheless, it's Scarlett is fighting a good fight. So I think we should weigh in. And just building on what you said, Pete. So last week, OpenAI, they had a live demo of their new GPT 4.0 model, which is a so-called multimodal model, which basically means not only can it now respond to inputs in text or audio form, but it can also use the camera on your device to see, if you like. So it's getting closer and closer to human-like senses, if you like. And look, I know I'm the resident tech bro on this podcast, but it was a pretty impressive demonstration. I mean, it was phenomenal. It showed its ability to solve complex maths and coding problems. It was its ability to sort of recognize human emotions or whatever else. But that's not what we're here to talk about, because the other thing that it did is it had a new level of emotion in the voice that was used to interact with people. And it was laughing. It sounded a lot more human. It responded to prompts.
It was flirting.
It was flirting, yeah. And also it was responding to, people could say, like, we want more enthusiasm or less enthusiasm, and it would give you that. I really would encourage people to watch the demo, because it was slightly scary, but it was also absolutely phenomenal, at least in my view. But you can all tear shreds off me for thinking that if you like. But the problems came because lots of people were comparing the voice of this character in the demo to that of Scarlett Johansson. And, as you mentioned, Peter, so Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, had, as it's turned out, has been sort of pursuing Scarlett to license her voice for the company for months. And Scarlett had refused. Now, there's so many things to talk about here, but I guess there's two really interesting points that I just want to mention. The first one is, it's just such a bizarre thing for Altman to want to do, because, it's been a while since I've seen the movie Her, and I do remember really liking it at the time, but it didn't end well for the main character, if I recall. And I don't know if falling in love with a computer is something that people will necessarily identify with and want. So I'm not sure why Altman thinks this would reflect well on his company, apart from perhaps it's just that Scarlett Johansson has a very sultry voice and maybe he just fell in love with her. I'm not sure, but that's one thing. I just think it's an obvious choice in a way, but it's also a strange choice because the movie is not a happy ending. No jokes, please. But the other part of it that I think is interesting is just the way that Scarlett has responded, because we've spoken on this show a few times about deep fakes and about people being exploited by OpenAI's ability to be able to mimic people's voices and go away and replicate it in a deep fake way, and the problems that have come with that. But Scarlett is kind of pushing back on this, calling for legislation and trying to establish new norms. And I'll finish my point with just this quote that she put out as part of a release, which I think is just sums it up perfectly. She says, "In a time when we are all grappling with deep fakes and the protection of our own likeness, our own work, our own identities, I believe these are questions that deserve absolute clarity." And I think I couldn't have said it better myself. But what does everyone else think?
Lizzie, what did you think of not just the launch of the Chatgpt, but the blowback that's occurred?
Yeah, Sam Altman does seem to be stepping on a lot of rakes at the moment. And this is interesting because there was this obviously a rift with his board whereby he left the company and then came back, and huge support from staff that justified his return, and then a shake-up of the leadership of the company. But the last kind of couple of weeks, you just sort of wonder why there's been so much hype about this guy, because he does seem to be making a lot of mistakes. And this is just one. I mean, there's other things as well going on in that respect. But to me, it just does seem like such an own goal. Like, you're picking a fight with an extremely powerful woman. Scarlett Johansson also is not frightened of litigating and has success in that arena. So it just seems like, why would you create an enemy in this way? I think it does raise really interesting questions about what kind of right you have to your identity and morality. Like, it was last time we spoke, we talked about that confected AI foreign affairs spokesperson or whatever it was, diplomat for the Ukraine. And some woman had been on The Bachelor equivalent in the Ukraine and had lent her voice and image to this AI generated spokesperson. And you do wonder, like, to what degree can people just take this kind of your likeness and use it in a way that you didn't intend, or can you actually commodify that, or should you be able to, and to what extent can you claw that back? And she's the one that's going to be the powerful person to determine some of these things. And in some ways, I'm not displeased to see her pushing these boundaries. But
it's almost like, if we need a human to be our lead litigant, then why not?
She's a good candidate for that, for sure. I also think it's funny that Brian Merchant points out that Sam Altman's got a bit of a history of misunderstanding movies. Like, I think Brian described him as understanding The Social Network as being a reflection of the great life of startups. Like, completely missed the message. And you do sort of feel.
And Oppenheimer are like vindication of physics, right?
Yeah, you should recruit people to become physicists. Like, he does seem to get the wrong end of the stick, and then it makes it his kind of life mission to carry that out, which is frightening. Like, we just shouldn't have to have the history of sophisticated technology in the hands of people who have like basic cultural literacy, among other things. But yeah, it's the whole thing's pretty alarming, and you do wonder when the leadership of that company, when he starts to they start to question it, because it's a competitive environment. Like, OpenAI is often framed as the leader, and it's true that it is, but there are a lot of significant competitors in this space, and I think continual missteps is going to cost them.
I guess, yeah, I was going to bring you in, Danny, like the idea of the big tech bro leader. Like, we've seen Elon Musk sort of going to war with the Australian government, and now sort of, Altman almost going to war with his own idea. What's your take on how that titular figurehead becomes, almost, a lightning rod for their technology?
I think the own goal that Altman's made here, I think, is that he's taken Scarlett Johansson's voice, and that makes it really personal, and people can really see and feel what that crime's like, because they feel they have a personal relationship with ScarJo. Okay, and so he's made it personal. And so the same guy took all of the content of all the world's publishers and used it, and no one really got up in arms about that, because
some of us did, Ricky. Some of us did. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, we did, but for the average person in the street, that was a crime that they couldn't really relate to, right? But once you do it to Scarlett, okay, then suddenly it feels real. And so I think that the own goal here ultimately is going to be that everybody is going to now understand why newspaper bosses are unhappy about their content being taken, because it's now been personalized and made relevant to them. and impacts on them directly. So I think it actually really is a significant change. It's funny that it's taken kind of an actress to make it also real, but it really does make it real. So I think that's going to be the mistake that he's going to pay for in the long term.
And you would have seen today the announcement that News Limited's done a content deal as well. I don't know if we go into that a bit later when we're diving deep, but it seems like, I don't think the two are connected, but what does that mean as well?
The thing, well, obviously, it's a big deal for News Corp. It's $250 million over 5 years. But I also thought it was kind of unfortunate timing as an own goal. So it was very, very gushing in the press release. So I don't know if you saw it about, this trustworthy person, Sam Altman's wonderful. I bet the press guys were thinking, oh no, I can't believe this is happening 24 hours after the ScarJo incident, because it just feels like completely the wrong message. Just felt like shooting yourself totally in the foot. But look, News Corp and a whole host of big companies, the Financial Times, Axel Springer, I mean, the list is getting longer of these companies that are doing these deals. The terms of these deals change every time. It's an evolving space. I know, Dan's had a lot of experience in trying to do these deals. I just think it's a really difficult deal to do. My personal opinion, the advice I'm giving media companies at the moment is to wait, because the value of these deals will increase over time, I think, not decrease. But at the end of the day, News Corp's done its deal.
Be fascinating to see if they have the same pile on Altman over Scarlett as they've been having over Meta, which kind of segues into the second piece, Lizzie. News Limited particularly, but the world is going to war on Meta and social media and wanting to keep kids off the platforms. It's everyone from the Prime Minister down, backing in the News Limited campaign, backed in with a few radio personalities. How are you looking at this, and should we take it as a serious policy intervention or just a leverage point for the News Media Bargaining Code?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, I feel extremely alarmed by this proposal to essentially ban under 16-year-olds from accessing social media. So not even just not being able to make an account, but seemingly not being able to access it. Although, it's a bit light on detail, but this includes not just for Facebook or X, but also LinkedIn, believe it or not, and also YouTube. And anyone who's got a toddler rolls their eyes at the prospect of banning young people from YouTube.
Banning young people from LinkedIn.
Let alone banning young people from
saving them from LinkedIn.
Everyone should be banned from LinkedIn on one level. But in some ways, I feel deeply disturbed by it, because there's this growing idea that this is really going to be the solution to these problems, that this is the cause of all ills among young people, and that seems to have a huge hold on the public. There's a lot of people who support this idea. But on another level, I do think the practical realities of such a proposal are starting to dawn on people. What would it look like to implement this? Essentially, what it means is age verification for everybody in the country. I don't think we've got the kind of capability to do that at this point. Then there's the question of VPNs, of kind of circumventing these kinds of prohibitions. But there is, what I think is just mostly quite disappointing about this discussion is that the missing people from this conversation is really young people. And there is limited research, but it is really interesting. And I think there should be more research in this field that talks about how young people experience social media. And I think they've got some really remarkably mature approaches to this. Like many everyday Australians, they don't particularly want to give up their privacy or particularly deal with some of the negative problems that arise from the business model of social media, but they see it as kind of the price that you have to pay to participate in online life, which I think is how a lot of adults also feel about the experience of being on some of these platforms. But they do also talk about wanting to have kind of conversations about this, about how you manage being online and avoiding the worst excesses of it, how you can navigate this, and particularly in relation to pornography. So a big part of this is also about potentially preventing young people from accessing pornography. And some of the research around that it's quite, I feel really strongly about it because it feels quite heartbreaking in ways. Like if you ask young people, generally what comes back in the research is they don't want an overall ban on pornography. They want to be able to have a discussion about how to situate it in their life experience. And I think a lot of young people access it before they're ready. But, there's a problem with making it a default form of sex education. But there's a lot of research suggests they want overall kind of comprehensive sex education and discussion about how to fit it into that experience, not a ban. And that, to me, it seems very mature. And so it's pretty disappointing that this discussion happens in a context in which we're not hearing from those people. But instead, what we hear is this kind of adult moral panic that is very easy for politicians to get on board with, especially when they're looking for a little bounce in the polls. And I just wish we could move past this approach to policymaking in this field. It feels ill-fitting for the problems that we're confronting.
Dan, how do you feel about it with your kids?
Very different to Lizzie, as it turns out. Not for the first time. I'm sure it won't be the last. But I mean, look, a couple of points I'll make just before I give you my take on it. I mean, I share, I guess, a little bit of the cynicism, but probably we all feel about the irony of News Corp, or the timing perhaps of News Corp prosecuting this case against Meta in particular, given that Meta has just pulled a whole bunch of funding from their organisation globally. But look, I think that age verification on social media, I think that the evidence is getting stronger, not less, that restricting access to this until children are a little bit older and a little bit more mature is mounting. I suspect I'm the only one who's a fan of this, but Jonathan Haidt's recent book, The Anxious Generation, laid out pretty clearly a pretty strong argument, in my view, that this generation of kids who are, entirely digital natives are far more anxious and have far more problems, and it's looking increasingly like a causal link, not a correlational link between that and the use of social media. And, I also I don't know a parent in my group, and, I feel this way about my kids, that doesn't feel like we should be restricting the limit. The challenge that we have, right, the challenge that you have as a parent is that at some point you have to give in because everybody else is on social media and your child is not, and they start to get excluded from the social situation. But I think certainly when I speak to my kids and kids in their network, and also parents in that same network, if you ask them all whether they could give up on it or have it later, you don't get much pushback. So I take your point, Lizzie. I mean, it's not a very nuanced debate which is taking place now, and there's certainly a role for education and whatever else, and teaching people to manage this better. But I think that age verification on these things is actually what is needed and what we're probably ultimately going to get to. Last point I'll say, though, and I think I agree with you, it's kind of impossible to do this now, because the only way you can really do this is by then mandating a whole bunch of identity verification on platforms that have proven that they don't deserve to have that identity information. So, until we get to a world where there is Tim Berners-Lee's pod system, where you can verify things third party in a secure way, or there was a legislation passed, that the Digital ID Bill 2024 recently, which effectively is potentially laying the framework for a voluntary digital identity system that can be used to verify your ID with third parties. Now, if that takes hold, if it proves to be secure, that could be a way that we could do this practically. I just don't think we're there yet, which means that this campaign probably goes nowhere. But my prediction is that in 10 years' time, this is in place, maybe even in 5 years' time. But fire it, Will.
Yeah, Ricky, where do you sit between the kind of prohibition model and Lizzie's more systemic response to what everyone agrees is a problem?
I think I'm perfectly set in the middle, actually. I've got 3 kids. My eldest is now interested in this space. The exact
Which space is that? The pornography space or the social media space?
Social media space.
Yeah.
So what I'm really interested in, there's a law coming together in the UK that's really interesting, where they're trying to flip the responsibility for assuring that the child is of a certain age from the parents to the platform. So the platform's responsible for validating that the child is of an appropriate age. Doesn't ban them from the platform, but they have to know that the child's of a certain age and they have to be registered. So the pressure has always been on the parents to police that, but now they've moved it to the platform, and there are penalties for the platform if it fails. That's a really interesting new twist, because there's a lot of guilt. I don't know whether you feel it, Dan, but there's a lot of guilt as a parent. You want to give your child access to the data or to the platforms that their friends are using, but at the same time, as a parent, you feel that you're failing in some way to protect them from it. The idea that you move the onus of responsibility to the parent, from the parent to the platform, is really quite interesting. Now, they haven't put together exactly yet how they're proposing to enforce it, But I do think it's an interesting twist to make sure that those who profit most are the ones that have to police it.
We might move on to the last news piece that is very self-referential that I'm going to bring together. So Center of the Public Square appeared in the Senate inquiry into AI and everything, a very broad terms of reference this week, just running up the flagpole, the idea of sovereign AI, the idea that effectively where we're ending up is a world where Australia is going to be totally reliant on either large language models from the States or China, or a combination of the two. What is the capability to build our own civic infrastructure, and how can we leverage the big platforms that are controlling the LLMs at the moment, your Microsofts, your Googles, your Metas, to get, they're not paying tax, but to give some recompense back into the into Australia that can be reinvested in building some sovereign capability. And we threw it out there with the idea of establishing a public AI commissioner to broker access to Australian information, and also to provide a base of models that not-for-profits and public sector can access in the public interest. And we kind of thought we'd be kind of laughed out, or just, yeah, that's nice, and go on. But the senators were very, very interested in it. We were lucky to be appearing alongside our friends from the Human Technology Institute, Nick Davis and Ed Santo, who know a lot more about this than we do, actually. And Nick made the point that probably with an investment of around 100 million US, you could start building the basis of some sort of local large language model. Like, it doesn't need to be everything. Like, you can build systems that then can work for public interest. And it was interesting. They said, go off and, they said to Nick, go off and give us a one-pager on how you'd spend $100 million. So I hope he's doing that homework before recording this. But I'm interested in your guys' thought. The idea, so we talk about local culture and we talk about Australian identity, and we talk about it in the context of culture. But if all our AI is going to be trained on foreign data sets that might sort of take a bit of us in the dredging, but there's going to be much more Scarlett Johansson, the Miranda Otto in our large language learning models. Like, does that mean anything? Is it a worthy aspiration to build some sovereign capability in this, or are we basically going to sort of have a world where we're just going to be a vendor of the global systems? Might start with you, Ricky. Is that too far out there?
It's not at all. I was in a conversation with a European nation this week, and one of the things they were talking about is that they want to, if Google is antitrusted in the antitrust case that's coming up in September 9th, one of the proposals under that, or one of the penalties for that, if the DOJ is successful in the US, is that they will take the data that Google has and make it available to everyone, because that data enables them to be a fantastic search engine. But there are many, many different things you can do with all of that data. And this particular nation state was saying to me that they would seek to own the data of their populace. They wanted to control the data of the information that they receive, and then to use that to benefit the GDP of their own nation, and to enable startups in their own nation, and to enable them to build effectively a splinter net, a national version of the internet contextually relevant to them, and the data controlled and limited for its use by the government, which raises a whole series of questions for those of you that have a legal bent on here that would know far better than me. But the very fact that nation states are starting to think about how they can use that data as their own, I think, is interesting.
Yeah, one of the analogies we used was we want to be a country that makes AI the way that the Swiss makes watches and the Danes make furniture. And that's actually that's a decision that government makes, then makes an investment. But that idea of some sort of accommodation with the large platforms for their extractive monopoly practices, it has some degree of attraction, doesn't it? What do you reckon, Lizzie? I don't know. You've got a legal case here.
I mean, the argument is, of course, that AI is, data plus computing power and, people, I suppose, to bring those two together. So it does require a bit of infrastructure, and I'm not sure how ready the government is to invest in that, in the sense that the question around sovereignty in this respect would have to extend, I think, also to other ways in which we outsource, our various policy initiatives when it comes to computing to US companies. But I think that's a good question to ask. Like, I don't think we have to just accept that this is the way the world needs to be, that you have to deal with Amazon if you want to,
Or the government making these massive deals with Microsoft to
or
access
Microsoft.
their AI, right?
Exactly. And so to that degree, I think there's some real utility in having that discussion. I think there's a widespread assumption that we're going to be a deployer, not a developer, but in terms of policy making at this minute. But I think it is worth expanding that conversation more greatly. Having said that, I do think there is a role to play in kind of sharing information across borders. Like the other kind of regulated field that comes to mind in these kinds of discussions is like aviation, where there's a huge amount of collaboration, information sharing in a marketplace that has achieved achieved a very high standard of safety. And there's an argument that kind of collaboration internationally, as well as kind of within the local industries, has utility for that objective. But I don't think that I think that approach could be adopted in a localized context as well. And yeah, within the local marketplace. So it's not necessarily, doesn't preclude a sovereign approach to AI. So it's just whether the government's actually interested in spending money on this infrastructure. I suspect it's going to take more than $100 million, but I'm interested to see what Nick comes up with.
Dan?
Yeah, I was going to make that point. I love this
I bet he
idea.
decided it was US dollars, by the way. So it's actually a little bit,
okay.
A bit more.
So it's 125 Aussie. Yeah,
Not
I
Swiss
think.
francs.
I don't think even pounds would cut it, but I think I love this idea in theory, and I just think that it's going to take well in excess of 100 million of any currency. I think it's going to be way more than that, because if you look at what's happening with this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with Ricky in a second. But if you look at what's happening with these, the dominant LLMs that are taking shape, I mean, it's becoming, as ever, the big dominant tech players that are going to control it. So you're going to have Google on one side, you're going to have Microsoft on another, potentially either in complete alliance with OpenAI or probably more likely, I think, in the long term, going on their own. And maybe OpenAI has got enough of a foothold now that they'll be able to stay and perhaps even partner with Apple. There's been some speculation about that. And so as a result of that, most people's interaction with these large language models, which are going to, I think, become more and more central in our lives, are once again going to be controlled by Silicon Valley-based companies in the US, or Seattle in the case of Microsoft, but nonetheless US-based companies. And so it would be great if we could take the lessons of the last decade or so and actually develop something locally, which is going to actually
wouldn't you love to have a local social network now? Like, and if you take the idea that the platforms will enshitify, and then you sort of expand it and maybe jumping into the discussion we're about to have, that AI kills the internet because it just enshitifies the whole internet, and we end up in a world where we have to start rewilding networks from scratch the way Maria Farrell's arguing, then surely little cottage, I don't know, I'm thinking of large language models as little cottage industries that grow up or something, but it doesn't all need to be coming down, does it? Or like, is there a world in which diversity creates strength, and that, different countries and different cultures will develop their own ways of processing all this collective information?
There is a bit of history here, or potential for this. So way back when, in the early 2000s, when Google was starting to grow, France built its own national search engine that preferenced French content first. You could access anything, but it actually built its own search engine, and it was free for everybody to use, and it was ad-free. So they had a go at building a national preferenced search engine. And then I think they gave up after about a year and a half because, Google was becoming the default. So it has been attempted. So there is
and Google was becoming the default, to be clear, because their investment in it was, 100x times anyone else that was making this investment, including Microsoft at the time, right? So that's how they won. And that's what you're up against with an idea like this, I think, unfortunately.
Oh, well, I've never shied away from big ideas. I just can't implement them. Hey, we better move on to the deep dive and give the floor to Ricky. Dan, you're long-term mate, so you can do the intros, but I just to flag that the catalyst for this invite was a terrific piece that Ricky wrote on his Substack, which has me totally obsessed with the idea that Google may actually be about to kill itself with its single click search. So that's the end of the story. But why don't we start with an intro and we can sequence out, even though I've sort of killed the punchline now.
Be nice, Dan. Come on.
Look, you've already had a bit of an intro, so perhaps I'll keep this brief, but I think it is worth just mentioning a couple of things, and that is that, apart from you being a journalist at different organisations in Australia and here and working for big tech companies, where we first came across each other was in your company, Uvu, which was an AI-powered video recommendation tool. That's probably a bad description, which you can correct me on in a second, Ricky, but it was an AI-powered tool before AI was a thing, right? So I think you have some expertise that you bring to this. But yeah, what's been interesting with what you've been doing lately is all the articles that you've been publishing on your Substack on this theme of what is going to happen to the big tech platforms and what is going to happen to search when these big tech platforms become effectively, the oracle and the font of all knowledge and just suck up the world's information. But with that intro, Ricky, where do you want to take it? Give us a take, if you like, on the status of what's happening to the global economy with internet economy with these changes and where you think we're going to head.
So the amazing thing was that there's nothing like an antitrust trial to give you like enough material to last for the next 10 years. The antitrust trial that Google had at the end of last year that delved into its search domination. I think everybody ignored it. They thought it was going to be a bit of a kind of, so what, we're all pretty happy with our search tools. But some of the details that came out in that court case were really quite startling. So the proof that from the Department of Justice in America, first of all, astonishing that America is prosecuting one of its most powerful companies and one of its most powerful exports in itself is a sign of just how alarmed the government had become by the power of that organization. But then the DOJ opened up on the first day and just said, we think that Google's a monopoly because it controls 91% of all entry to the web. I mean, it's quite, that sounds like a monopoly. It feels like you're going to struggle to push back from there. And then the data that they were able to reveal that, various email discussions amongst senior executives had been deleted, that they had senior executives in Google boasting about how wonderful it was that search was as addictive as cigarettes, only it was more profitable. I mean, it was all just a bad look. And they just kind of surfaced all of this. And there's too much to go into. I mean, it would take all day to go into it, but the court case was really, really interesting in taking the lid off just what's actually going on in these companies. And so for me, I was inspired at that point to understand more about just how dominant is this company. So I went and bought shares in all of the tech companies so that I receive all of their updates and all their alerts. And so I can attend all of their shareholder meetings. And so when they talk in the shareholder meetings, you start to discover some amazing things. So, for example, in the last quarter, so Amazon, Google, or Alphabet, Meta, and Amazon wrote $412 billion in 90 days. Okay, you're talking $4 billion a day. Yeah, Google wrote $621,000 a minute. Okay. The numbers are astronomical. And once you start to look at the size of that and you realize that these companies are larger than nation states, they're as large as half of Europe, you suddenly start to realize that it really starts to get a bit frightening. And so I've been focusing really hard on just what is the power and influence of those companies when they get to that kind of size. But what's most interesting of all is that my attention is kind of focused at just the moment that governments globally are trying to break these companies up. And so I think that this is going to be a fascinating 12 months ahead because we've got lots of antitrust cases happening. And by the end of this year, the next Google antitrust case, the one where they're explicitly calling for the company to be broken up, starts on September 9th. So very, very soon, the world might be a completely different shape and the entire global digital economy might be different. So it's a fascinating time to be alive and start to look at some of that.
But Ricky, even if they do break Google up, which I mean, my take would be that I think that's unlikely, but we live in hope. But if they do, it doesn't necessarily change the moment that we're in, right? Where effectively what is happening with AI is Google is becoming an answers engine rather than a referral to other sources on the web. And that is only going to increase their economic power in my mind. But do you agree? Like, what do you think is going to happen with the impact on AI on these big companies?
No, I've got a different view. So the reason that these companies have grown so large and so powerful is because governments in the US decided to set the playing field to enable them to grow to almost any scale, or to all the way to this scale and beyond, by changing a series of interesting rules. So to start with, they passed a law called Section 230. And Section 230 said that as a platform, they're not responsible for what they publish. And so if you believed that the web was going to be won by whoever had the largest scale, you just give an impunity to a couple of companies to be able to do absolutely anything they wanted to scale. And of course, they ran off and became $13 trillion worth of market cap. But the rest of the world didn't have that protection. It was just given to platforms. So publishers didn't have it. So Section 230 broke the economics of the news media industry, in my opinion. The other thing that changed was fair use, which is a unique American version of copyright that says that you can use anything you want without permission as long as you grow the market as a whole, okay, and that there's a benefit to the market as a whole, which is why somebody like Google feels that it's okay, or OpenAI feels it's okay, to go and suck up an entire copy of the internet to create their AI. So if you've got Section 230 and you've got fair use happening in concert, it creates an almost impossible ability for anybody that's a premium publisher that does get prosecuted for defamation or prosecuted for contempt to be able to scale or compete. And so, in my view, the media industry has been hogtied effectively to guarantee its failure. And that law was passed in '96. So to say it's outmoded for today, all right, it's done its job. We probably don't need it anymore. But to come back to your point with regards to Google's decision to change from the way we know search as 10 links, 10 blue links, that search we're all au fait with, the one we know well. The proposal for them now is that instead of it doing that, you ask a question and it will go and search the open web, bring the results back, write its own version, and then publish that version as the search result. And the challenge with that is that it means that any link to the originating provider of that content doesn't even appear on the first page of the search result. Okay, it's off the first page, which means that the traffic referred back, or the viewers referred back to the originator of the content, is going to go down by 35 to 40% in the most hopeful version, which makes it very, very difficult again to compete. Now, the piece that has really caught people's attention is that if you take those two things I've just talked about, Section 230 says that a tech platform is a platform and not a publisher, and therefore not liable to any responsibility for the content that it publishes. That is not carried. That does not stay the same if the platform takes the content, rewrites it, and publishes it. So Google pivots from being a platform to a publisher and is no longer protected by Section 230. And that is going to be a game changer when that starts to impact on their results.
Lizzie?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me in the sense that, you can think of somebody or Scarlett Johansson Googling herself and then the answer comes back that she's the voice of Chatgpt and she says, no, I'm not. Like there's a potential there for it to be misleading, but in a way that is actionable by individuals that, previously it would bring up sources. So I think it's a huge risk for them. Not just because there's potential, descriptions of people that are defamatory. And I would say in Australia, there has been some case law around even the the small summaries or snippets of articles, whether that constitutes publication. And our courts are a bit more inclined to treat Google as a publisher as compared to US courts. So, and I think there's probably some geographic nuance as well as to how these things are managed. But Australia is a pretty weird place for tech policy. But what I would say is it's not unprecedented that this kind of thing might occur. But the problem, I think, as well, is like what happens when it's wrong. Like I was looking at someone who was experimenting tonight, talking about how one of the recommendations for stopping cheese sliding off your pizza is to add glue to the to stick the cheese to the pizza. You know, like these kinds of things which you can see immediately that you become immediately wrong, right? And so, I mean, I do wonder, I don't know if I'm being one of those people that says, oh, you know, let's keep the horse and cart or the newspaper or the vinyl. But like, I reckon there's a market for people who are looking for sources, not summaries from tech companies too. Like, I don't go to Chatgpt to search for a topic or some kind of, you know, account of history. Like I'd go to Wikipedia, for example, but I wouldn't necessarily go to Chatgpt. And part of what I think about something like Wikipedia is there is a transparency in the process, you know, and I wonder whether there's an assumption that people will want this kind of frictionless service when in fact it may be more common that people want different kinds of things from their search functions. And one thing I would say about Google is they have, you know, Cory Doctorow would say this, like they had one good product and then they've launched a whole lot of bad ones that they have since abandoned or acquired anything that was any good. And I do wonder whether they're actually, like we've assumed that this will be the future of their search, and it's not beyond them to kick an own goal. And then, in fact, you know, a service like DuckDuckGo may end up being far more popular because it kind of sticks with a different way of approaching search. And in an age in which people are more skeptical of companies, do they want to outsource even basic kind of searching to tech companies when they're not trustworthy? So I do query whether they're reading the market well, but I don't know if I'm just being naive.
Let me just put this one to you as a thought, and I'm interested in your thought on it, is that there's one, defamation is incredibly expensive. If you make a mistake in a newspaper and you say something that's defamatory, you'll get sued and you'll end up paying millions and millions and millions of dollars, okay? And that's based on, you know, was it done with malice? Was it reckless? How badly did it impact on the individual? It's almost a badge of honor in the AI companies at the moment to laugh about how it hallucinates. Oh, you know, it just got it wrong. It's okay, it doesn't matter, we'll figure it out, it'll be fine. I don't think a court's going to take kindly to the fact that I just defamed somebody, but it's okay, I'll figure it out. I don't think I'm getting there is a defense, okay? And I think it's going to be very painful for them the first time it happens. And so in defamation, it's going to be expensive, okay? But we already know these companies don't care about how expensive things are. They've got enough money not to worry. But in contempt, that's a criminal matter. And so the first time it hallucinates and then ends a case that's taking place in front of a jury because it just hasn't figured it out yet, someone goes to jail for that, okay? And I know this because having been a newspaper editor, I know what it means when you get an incident of contempt, okay? They go straight for the top and somebody's told to pack a toothbrush. So I think that the idea that the tech companies are going to go, well, figure it out, we're just not quite there yet. And the first time one of those AI-generated responses ends a court case, there's going to be a real problem here. And I think that's when the rubber hits the road on this.
You might be right, Ricky. I mean, this could end up, because of the risk that's involved with this, particularly around things like new or top, you know, verticals like news, if you like, because the risk is so high and because them moving to become a publisher, probably untested at this stage, but I think your theory holds, or is likely to hold, then perhaps this is something which ends up being a good thing. But there's this whole other part of Google, which is most of its business, which is just pure utility, like book me into the local restaurant, for example. And I think this is where the shakeup around that there's a whole bunch of digital businesses, mine included, by the way, there's a whole bunch of digital businesses which provide a utility of some kind to the end consumer that Google doesn't. And if you end up in a world where, whether it's Google or OpenAI or someone else, where there's a sort of a pervasive assistant that can do all of this for you because it reads the whole web and does it, then that potentially puts, you know, millions of businesses out of business, if you like. And that's the risk that I think is people are starting to realize now. So yes, obviously, the thing that's getting the most attention at the moment is that, if you want to read about the war in Ukraine, you can just ask OpenAI, you can just ask Google Gemini, and it will tell you. And that's a massive threat to people not clicking through to news sites. And because news sites are writing about this and have a vested interest, they're all writing about it, right? But there's this whole other world of other internet based companies or online based companies which provide services that are sort of feed off Google, if you like, and feed off Google traffic referral, which are potentially going to be completely redundant in this new world.
That's an antitrust problem, right? Like, we started by talking about antitrust, and the traditional framing of this in the second half of the 20th century was around prices, the capacity for monopolies to jack up prices. And this was sort of confounding when in fact something like Google charges nothing, right? How do you make sense of this? And there's this return then to the original principles of antitrust, which is the problem is when companies become too dominant, they influence how government makes decisions, they influence the ecosystem. And I think that's the correct way to think about this. That's an antitrust problem, right? They can't just absorb all these different, it's essentially a vertical monopoly for provision of services through a digital platform. It starts to look like something you could break up potentially. There are other tools, I suppose, at the disposal to deal with that as well. And in fact, may preempt that to the point where they can't pursue that kind of mass domination of your experience of the internet. I think they will butt up against some of these things, and we've now got the benefit of kind of 10 years of rethinking how people understand the purpose of antitrust away from just consumer welfare, which will serve us well in this next iteration of the web.
Yeah, I agree. That's a beautiful description of antitrust. The other piece, of course, is that it stifles innovation. So when you have one company that's a black hole, no one else can compete. And so one of the requests of the DOJ in its case for the September 9 antitrust trial is that it wants to force Google to make all of its data available to all of its competitors. Now, you can imagine that's not going to go down terribly well for a company that's just spent countless billions of dollars building this monopoly moat, if you like, through data. But, Bing is arguing that no matter how good Bing search is, it can never compete because it's never going to get there, because Google has 16 times as much data as Bing will ever have. And so it can't grow, so it can't get better. And so if that happens and all of the other search engines are given the data, then what you're going to see is a whole new flourishing of new different ways of discovering content on the web, which is really what antitrust is for. It's to break open the opportunity for new opportunity to emerge. Okay, so the web is smothered. 91% of people going there, as I mentioned earlier, go there via Google. The world will be better, I think, if there are 91 different ways to enter the web, that we can all choose the one that's best for us.
Which brings in the toilet theory of the internet, which was a great piece in The Atlantic by Charlie Warzel. And I have a toilet theory of Twitter, which has been well ventilated on this program, but it was an interesting piece in the context of single-click search, which was the idea that most people who are using the internet are basically on their toilet and they're just passing the time. But if all you've got is the single click, you're actually doing away with search, because the idea of search is a vector to somewhere else on the internet. And so even there was a kind of a line between your Substack and this single click was an inflection point where Google becomes a publisher. And I think this argument that it's also the point at which Google just becomes the toilet and there is nowhere to go out of it once you flush. And I do think that there is a sense that we use entries into the web to find things, to find news or to find a doctor if we're using Dan's site. And Google can't take all that because it is actually not what we're after. We're not after a summary of things. We're after directions to little ecosystems that exist in different parts of this amazing network that has been built almost by accident.
And as I've heard you say on this podcast before, the real danger here as well, of course, I've been running an AI company for the past decade. one of the real problems you've got is model collapse, right? So we know that at the moment there are about 15 million URLs being written every single day by Gen AI. Okay, so the entire web is being flooded with new content that's written by an AI, and you don't know if it's true or you don't know if it's true. But the problem is if you're using Google search and it's doing it with its search generative experience or whatever it's called today, then that is not going to know the difference between what's Gen AI and what's not. So if it's gone to the open web to look for something and it's found something and it's brought it back, and then it's brought back a Gen AI article that the Gen AI at Google is now rewritten again, you're just stirring the nonsense into more nonsense, and the whole thing's just going to collapse on itself. And so it makes...
Well, that's dead internet theory, isn't it? That's the dead web theory, that
it is the dead web.
It kills itself.
It's entirely the dead web theory, and it is the inevitable result of where we are today. So either we don't have Gen AI to create stuff on the web and you use Gen AI to be the communication of the factual information, or you don't use the Gen AI to deliver it back to the consumer and let the consumer choose. But you can't have the machine going wrong at both ends and expect it to be a good outcome.
But I also thought the point that you made was good, Ricky, that there's a whole cottage industry around search engine optimization. What happens in a context like this where there's a different form of optimization that occurs? It also has a pull factor, like it creates these industries. And it's like how there's those restaurants now called Tiny Me because people type in Tiny Me and then that gets the top result because it's been named for optimization purposes. And that's the other consequence of a 91% market share, that you end up creating a whole industry that determines and reacts back against other industries in the real world in a way that is, flattening. It's kind of miserable. A whole variety of problems, and also people have to frame their whole business around the whims of a large American tech company, which is just, it just shouldn't be how an economy is structured. There's so many obvious problems with that kind of dependency. And this makes it much worse because it's even more opaque, the kind of people trying to game it and re-engineer it. Like, who does that become? Like, could it be malicious state actors? Like it doesn't even have to be the local Thai restaurant. Like it can be much more sophisticated regimes of disinformation and stuff. So it creates all sorts of extra vulnerabilities, I think, too.
I'm sure Dan would agree with me when I say that, there's an entire generation of people in newsrooms now who've been born only in the Google era. And so to them, they think Google is the only way to reach the reader. There are thousands of people working in advertising that believe that Google is advertising. Okay, they've never lived under anything else, and that's what domination looks like. And I've sat in quite a few newsrooms where people have said to me, well, we can't do that because we have to send it off to SEO to do this. The beauty of journalism and the beauty of art is not to create one flavor of everything, right? Then otherwise, why have it? Right. And so the beauty of the web was an opportunity for it to be a digital democracy, for us to use our creative skills and for all of us to succeed or fail based on our own efforts. Okay. And we all wanted to communicate to the world, but we don't communicate to the world. We communicate to Google. And that's what monopoly is. And that's what worries me most. The world's actually a poorer place for creativity because we have to do it all in a format that it gets.
But surely Google and Meta and Twitter and TikTok are only as strong as the network. And if they stop providing what people want, they lose. Surely they know that if they turn the thing to shit, they're undermining their business model. Like, we are not AIs. We are not going to be programmed to just keep using it if it's not giving us access to the things that we want to go there for.
Well, I come back to the point made earlier. It won't be the first time that Google's made a mistake like that. Okay, and so
big mistake.
But the problem is that this time they're making a mistake with their Wonder tool. Okay, that impacts on everybody, which is why it's so important, right? So Dan, I don't know what you think, but I don't want an AI-driven web. I think there's still there needs to be a human in the mix. There aren't many humans in this model.
No, I think we all would agree with that, Ricky, and we've talked about this before. And I think the hope is that with the inshitification of the web and everything becoming a toilet, that people become more intentional with how they access information and how they access news and culture and everything else. The worry, though, is that there's not enough people that do that, and there's obviously going to be a bit of carnage on the way through. And I take your point; it could be a Google misstep. if they go down this. Hey,
Scott, there's
it's a
four of us.
Yeah, there's four of us. That's right. Yeah, we'll start a trend. But the worry though is that I know I harp on about this, but it feels like OpenAI is such a shift that it might remove Google's dominance. So hear me out on this. I mean, Google at the moment, to your point, I think, Pete, is incentivized to keep the web going, at least on life support, so that they can harvest all of the money that's to be made off it, right? And they're not incentivized to just become, that nothing but a place for shit answers. But Microsoft are actually incentivized to change the economics of that business model. And so if Microsoft gets enough of a foothold using OpenAI's tech or their own over time, whereby they become a really effective sort of assistant, Oracle, whatever else, and they change the economics of Google and the internet, then maybe the shift that the world changes a little bit and they gain more control. But I guess the reason, I mean, this is strange. I'm normally the one that's more optimistic on this podcast than not. It feels like I'm the negative Nancy today. But my fear is then it's you're passing the dominance of one platform to another, and we're just in the same shit circumstance. And everyone in Australia where we don't have these things is no better. But maybe I'm being too cynical.
Or to round it out, maybe this is why Scarlett Johansson is the most important person on earth right now.
I'll be the
maybe you're
optimist. I've got a feeling that the sun is setting on Meta and Google as a friend to media. I think it's been a friend of me. I think it's now an enemy. I think that's clear. But it does mean that there may be a changing of the guard. It may be a situation, to your point, Dan, and I agree with you, that OpenAI and Microsoft have the most to gain by trying to create a better web, to be honest. And Amazon has the most to gain by creating premium advertising, because it's now the third largest advertising company in the world. And so it might be that media's best friends for the next year or two or three or four or five, maybe, who knows, might be Microsoft and Amazon rather than Google and Meta. But hopefully this time, Dan, you and I both have had a front row seat in this. Maybe this time we can do a better job of building a sustainable model with the time.
Well, what is that optimistic future, guys? So, put your optimist hats on with everything we've just spoken about. What's the optimistic view of a media that serves a well-informed public?
You want to go first, Dan?
I'm just trying to think of what that would be. I mean, it's probably what we've touched on, right? It is probably it gets worse before it gets better, but it's the web becomes full of spurious information of little value, and people become much more intentional about where they get their information, and people build direct audiences in a way that they were able to in the early days of the web. I mean, if that happens, that would be amazing. That would be amazing. But the worry for me is that it's not that, and it's actually just, we've already seen the harm of everyone becoming a publisher and getting their news from social media without the gatekeepers. As much as they had their own problems, at least there was a level of commitment to journalistic principles as part of that, which has gone out the window. And I worry now that is it going to happen fast enough, or is there just going to be so much bad information out there that it doesn't make it, but more and more people are fooled. But again, maybe I'm being too negative for once.
I agree with Dan that it gets worse before it gets better. There's going to be a trough before there's a spike. But what I'm hopeful for is that we're going to see this splinter now. We're going to see Google go down market and become the Walmart of the web, the Wild West web. There's some Gen AI, some not, lots of advertising, but very cheap. But there'll be a premium web where premium content will exist in the same way as you used to go and download your music on MP3, and it might be good or it might be not. And then we had iTunes. Okay, it's the same thing. I'm hoping we're going to see a premium web that we might have to pay for that can enable us to reset a premium web where you can get good content.
Any final thoughts or prayers, Lizzie?
I mean, I'm not a media person. I'm a law person. So all I just think about is like, what can you do from a legal perspective to kind of guard against this, or what can government do as policymakers? And so I don't know. I feel like there's still lots of things that can happen to improve the quality of the information state that require state investment, that don't necessarily compromise good quality journalism. And there's huge, like, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's huge amounts of interesting content that is made possible by a web at the moment. That sure, that, the key gatekeepers in the digital age, like Google, may wish to to intervene in how you access that, but it still exists. I mean, Ricky's got a Substack, you know, that's one example. There's all sorts of other ways in which people now have access to media that was not really compatible with traditional models of 50, 100 years ago, I think. And that's good, you know, like I think there is the beginnings of an alternative exist. I'd want to improve, but, you know, government could then do some work investing in the mainstream creation of information and content, like the equivalent of AAP or Reuters or whatever. There's lots of ways in which I think there is the role of the state, a role that a state can play to elevate the quality of the information available and allow for a flourishing in a diverse range of analytical voices in the space that hopefully is even improved on what traditional media gatekeepers used to provide.
Well, on that positive note, been a good conversation. That was positive. Like we ended up sort of lifting up I think the future is Substack without the Nazis. That's a good place to land. But you know, thanks for being part of it. And jokes aside, terrific piece on your Substack, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Future Media. Dan, Lizzie, thanks for your time. We'll catch you in a fortnight, and that's it for another Burning Platforms.
Thanks, folks.
Cheers, guys. That was Burning Platforms, brought to you by Per Capita's Centre of the Public Square. It was recorded on May 23 and produced on Naarmland by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.